Mental health awareness and suicide prevention programming is something I am passionate about. And in order to launch programming, we first have to learn what areas are most affected. That is why I chose to map suicide rates at a global and national level. The purpose of the map that I created through Tableau was to get a visualization of the global trend in suicide rates, which, as you can see, seems to be going down, since you can see countries that were a darker tone are becoming lighter, meaning that suicide rate is going down. Despite this trend, there were several articles that I found that stated that suicide rates in the United States were actually going up rather than down, which is why I decided to focus in the United States and its suicide rates. Uh, for all the data I gathered was from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that had suicide rates per 100,000 population. And I also want to note that all of my maps have the contiguous USA Albers projection. Okay, so for map 1, this shows the 2016 suicide mortality rate in the US. And for this, I chose a sequential color scheme because it is a good way to visualize values that go from low to high, like it is in the case for suicide rates. Lighter colors indicate lower rates of suicide, and darker colors indicate higher rates of suicide. I use equal interval classifications since it divides a range of attribute values into equal sizes. Um, and I used the orange to gold color scheme and divided it into 5 classes to establish a clear visualization of suicide rates per state. For map 2, this shows suicide rate change from the year 2015 to the year 2016. I used equal interval classification for this map and the same sequential color scheme because I wanted these two maps to be uniform. The difference is that I added align fill symbols into the states that had the highest negative suicide rate change, meaning that suicide rate actually increased. This also, I think, allows the audience to recognize the states with the lower colors that mean that they improved in suicide rates, while those in darker tones um, actually have higher suicide rates than before. Map 3 shows the 2016 suicide deaths by using proportional symbols. So the size of the symbol is actually determined to the number of deaths. So the bigger the dot, the more suicide related death in the country. I mean in the state. I chose to simplify the state polygons to give focus to the symbols. I also use callout text to identify the 3 states with the highest number of deaths, which were California, Texas, and Florida. And I provided the number of deaths and the suicide rate pertaining to that state. For my last map, I chose to depict the suicide rate per state through pie charts. And focusing on the suicide rate per sex. So the size of the pie chart again is determined by the number of suicides. Each state has a pie chart that is divided into 2 fields, female and male, which I assigned a color to each, which I think will be easy for the audience to acknowledge and quickly see what sex has an overall higher suicide rate. I also included again callouts to highlight the states that had the highest suicide deaths, as previously mentioned: California, Texas, and Florida. And I just wanted to recognize what the suicide rate per sex was in these 3 states. And finally, I just think that maps like these could be helpful when assessing which states should be targeted when it comes to mental health and suicide prevention based programming, and which can potentially lower suicide rates.